Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you watch this. Uh, you're very welcome to come to the session on the uh, civil military technology interface, weaponization of outer space. But actually, the space is now becoming as the strategic arena for competition, and there is increasing security-driven competition in space, which compelled the many states to develop a counter-space capabilities that is used to disrupt, deny, or destroy space systems. These activities need to be regulated to ensure safe, secure, sustainable use of outer space for all. The militarization of space points to the urgent need to develop new norms and rules, but we need a better understanding of key issues such as space weaponization or the counter space capabilities. So for discussing that, we have a fantastic panel of the four different from 4 different countries, 4 experts on these matters. Victoria Samson, Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation. Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Ajey Lele, Senior Fellow of Institute of Defense Study Analysis, and Jana Robinson, Managing Director of Prague Security Studies Institute. And my name is Kazuto Suzuki. I'm a professor of the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo, and I'm moderating this discussion. So let me just start with your opening remarks for let's say 5 minutes each. So let's start from Victoria. Victoria, you have floors.
Thank you, Kazuto, and thank you, ORF, for inviting me to participate here with such esteemed colleagues. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. So I'll be talking a little bit about counterproliferation trends that I've seen over the past few years. Right now, as Kazuto mentioned, we are seeing an upward trend in counterspace capabilities being proliferated globally as more countries incorporate space capabilities into their national infrastructure and use it to enhance their military capabilities and national security. This has led more countries to also look to develop their own counterspace capabilities. There are global repercussions that go well beyond the military sphere. Part of this proliferation is in the number of countries building up military space organizations as part of their interest in protecting their national space assets. Russia and China both have military space organizations. In 2019 alone, there was a creation of military space organizations by 4 countries: the United States, France, India, and Japan. Although it should be noted the United States Space Force was built upon existing military bureaucracy. In the past year, we have seen Australia, Germany, and the United Kingdom launch their own versions of this as well. While the existence of military space organizations does not automatically translate to an offensive counterspace capability or even an interest, it does indicate that the host country is evolving their use of space to include military aspects and are open to considering developing some sort of counterspace capability. Because the reason given, at least partially, for why such a bureaucracy is needed is that there are threats to space capabilities and a response is needed. Another part of this proliferation can be seen in a recent uptick in anti-satellite tests. Since 2005, there have been more than 20 tests of anti-satellite weapon systems in space by 4 countries. A rate of testing that has not happened since the 1960s. Another concerning development is that some satellites have been observed to make deliberately close approaches to the satellites of other countries without coordination, prior knowledge, or consent of the operators of those satellites. There is a growing concern that such behaviors might increase tensions between countries or could be misinterpreted as hostile action that precipitates an armed attack. I feel obligated to say that Secure World produces its own counterspace threat assessment, an annual report called Global Counterspace Capabilities, which looks at counter space capabilities being developed by multiple countries across 5 categories: direct ascent, co-orbital, electronic warfare, directed energy, and cyber. There's a lot going on. It's a long document. I'm not going to try to summarize it right now, but in general, while there's development across a whole host of capabilities by many countries, only non-destructive capabilities are actively being used in current military conflicts, although it does appear that there is some research and development being done in destructive capabilities, but so far those have not been used. And then finally, the last trend I'll mention before turning over the mic is the development and expansion of space situational awareness, or SSA capabilities, both at the national and the commercial level. Reliable and accurate SSA is very important in verifying actions in orbit. And while SSA is not uniquely used for counterspace, it is a critical enabler for both offensive and defensive counterspace operations. And it's very important in order to identify whether responsible or irresponsible behavior is happening. So with that, I'll stop. I look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. By the way, Japanese military space organization is also based on the existing bureaucracy. So it's, I think most of the countries are in a similar situation. So let's hand over to Malcolm.
Thanks, Kazuto. I think that what we're seeing is in many respects similar to the early days of the growth of air power, when we think about the establishment of space organizations and space forces. There's a recognition on the part of all states that space is a militarized domain. It has been a militarized domain since the beginning of the space age, and there's growing dependency on space capabilities for warfighting, particularly in terms of joint and integrated operations and the requirement for a knowledge advantage. And so this growing dependency on space capabilities naturally generates a counter response in the form of counter space capabilities that are now becoming ever more sophisticated compared to what was in existence back in the Cold War. So you are seeing the growth of more sophisticated soft kill capabilities that are far more usable than even the hard kill capabilities that we've seen operationally deployed by the likes of China. And it's the soft kill capabilities, the ability of counter space capabilities to disable or damage rather than physically destroy, that I think have to be the most worrying, because these are the most usable systems. I think every state is recognizes the risk of using kinetic kill or hard kill systems that physically destroy satellites and create huge clouds of space debris that then essentially denies space to all. So from a purely military perspective, what I'm focused on in terms of my research is how soft kill capabilities, whether they're ground-based, whether they're direct ascent, or whether they're co-orbital, are going to evolve in the next few years. And the potential for those soft kill capabilities to be employed in a gray zone in orbit type operation, where a state might seek to exploit a third-party actor to avoid attribution in any offensive use of soft kill counter space capabilities. I think in terms of the development of space forces, as I said, we are in the early days of this. And in the same way that air power evolved over decades after the Wright brothers first flew, I think you'll see space forces evolve. And it's that debate over what is the role of space forces in the coming decades that I think is going to be very interesting and very critical. Finally, let me say some points about how we avoid the worst possible outcome, which is uncontrolled rush to space weaponization. There's a lot of activity in the legal and the regulatory and the diplomatic sense in terms of trying to provide solutions that can build upon the 1967 Outer Space Treaty and to strengthen regulatory norms against irresponsible behaviour. The UK submitted a General Assembly resolution last year on establishing norms of responsible behaviour in space. And I think this is a good basis to go from in terms of building up the potential for example, banning kinetic kill ASATs that do create the space debris that we all want to avoid. But those legal and regulatory and diplomatic measures need to be backed up with solid deterrent capabilities in space to make it harder for an adversary to utilize counter space capabilities. And from an Australian perspective, that's where we're focused on. the establishment of a space division in the Royal Australian Air Force headquarters, the consideration of ground-based space electronic warfare capabilities, the more serious discussion about space control and access to space, including sovereign access to space, is all part of developing our ability to establish resilient space capabilities that boost space deterrence. So we're in for interesting times ahead in terms of developing space capabilities, countering counter space capabilities, and establishing new types of organizations, and most importantly, new thinking and new strategy on how space as an operational environment will be utilized in future warfare. And I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. I think it's important to distinguish between the hard kill and soft kill, and that creates the much more complication of how to balance and how to maintain the rules and the norms for both hard kill and the soft kill. So let me turn over to Ajay.
Thank you, Chair. Greetings to you all. I think the subject which we are discussing is about a civil-military technology interface and how it will have an impact on the possibility of a weaponization of a space. So in that context, what I feel is that let's slightly go back to the history. During the period of the Second World War, or even during the Cold War period, we have always seen that technology first used to get developed into a military domain. The examples of computers, internet, GPS. And then subsequently, these technologies have come to the civilian domain. Even a technology like your car seat belt, essentially it started with development of some sort of a mechanism for the pilot in the cockpit. So we have seen the progress of a technology essentially from a military domain. But presently now we are in an era where commercialization is outdoing the entire military activities. And a lot amount of efforts are being put into a civilian domain for the development of a technology. I think our concern should be more to look at those technology developments slightly more critically, because there is always a view that the development of a technology, even in developed countries now, for the commercial reasons could be easily parted for a civilian purposes with other countries too. And there could be certain amount of a danger that these technologies could be misused or could be used for the purposes of developing counter space technologies. If I have to really look at the entire domain of a civilian sector and a military sector, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritties of the technologies, but just to name a few. Now we are talking not of a 5G, but we are talking of a 6G era. We are talking of artificial intelligence. Now it is almost coming into every sector of a technology development. So the way the technology is making a progress, obviously in years to come, this particular technology could find its inroads into a space domain to start with, and subsequently into a counter space domain too. Then 3D printing is actually going to revolutionize the entire industrial setup all over the world. Already you have seen instances of satellite components or parts of the International Space Station also printed at International Space Station by using 3D printers. So this is one technology, because it becomes very easy to part with this technology. You just have to email somebody the software part of it, and this other end can develop a technology for whatever purposes they want to. Hypersonic weapons is again a technology. Of course, this is a purely military technology, but this technology has got certain amount of other technological inputs which could go into development of this technology. When this technology fully matures, it is actually going to challenge the entire missile defense architecture and indirectly your present forte of a nuclear deterrence system also. So this technology can give rise to technologies into sensors, into ramjet engines, in smart materials. So there is certain amount of things which one has to look at it. Quantum technologies is making a huge inroads into cryptography as well as quantum computing. The present notion of a cybersecurity is going to be totally useless when quantum technologies actually become a reality. As all you know that China has already even launched a quantum satellite. So one has to really look at these technologies from different perspectives. Now let me come to the space domain. In space domain also, there are a lot amount of new technologies and new ideas which have been floated. And most of these ideas are welcome. But at the same time, as you understand that every technology development can be a boon or a bane. In that context, one has to look at these technologies. Space station, now there was only one space station, but there are countries who are showing interest that yes, we also want to have our own space station. Low Earth orbit is slowly started getting cluttered because of internet accessibility being available through space. Then there are various few other technologies like space debris eradication technologies. One is not sure how these technologies could be used subsequently. Then there are on-orbit servicing, refueling of satellites out into the space, SSA networks, already it has been mentioned. Space solar power could emerge, also a interesting technology, and people are keeping a watch on it in future. So all these things indicate that a rapid progress is happening into various emerging fields of technologies, what we call nowadays as disruptive technologies. And at the same time, in the domain of a space, also a lot amount of other technologies, lot amount of a new interesting projects which has been looked at. So when we are talking in this era of Industry 4.0, I think it is offering us an opportunity to check the feasibility of these emerging technologies in different domains. And that's where, as it has been already mentioned, that there is a possibility that countries could opt for soft kill options by expanding or juxtaposing these technologies towards the weaponization of a space. And I think at this point in time, we need to monitor, control, and stop the possibility of a civil military technology interface towards assisting the weaponization of a space. And there needs to be a very nuanced debate on this subject. And it's not that one size fits all will matter over here, but one has to take slightly more holistic view. And I think only at the level of a United Nations or as a multilateral agenda, this debate should come forward. And one should ensure that the development of a technology should not be banned, but at the same time, the misuse of this technology for the purposes of a weaponization of a space should be looked more closely and should be monitored more closely. I think I'll stop over here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the sort of a set of the catalog of new technologies. And I think it is also interesting that it's not the technology which matters, but it's the use of the technology. And I think that's a great point. So now I'll turn to you, Jana, for your opening remarks. Jana, you have your floors.
Thank you, Kazuto. Good evening, everyone. First, I wish to thank the Observer Research Foundation for inviting me to contribute to this important session of their CyFy 2021 conference. I thought it will first be useful to look at the broader space picture that shapes the security environment. According to the Union of Concerned Scientists, there are now more than 4,000 active satellites in orbit. As Victoria mentioned, we're witnessing the expansion of existing national space programs and the popularity of small satellites and mega constellation concepts such as Starlink, Kuiper systems, or OneWeb. There's also a desire by an increasing number of nations to have independent access to space-based information and critical technologies. In addition to government launchers, non-governmental launch vehicles and launch service providers have emerged in recent years. Reusable launch vehicles have likewise become a reality. Space applications are prominent in military, civil, and commercial operations. The connection between satellite services and individual consumers continues to grow, as does the complexity of data architectures, as Ajay mentioned, including making use of, for example, AI-originated technological innovations. In short, the environment is more diverse with disruptive technologies and commercial actors. Moreover, as Malcolm mentioned, the ability of nations to leverage space for defensive as well as offensive purposes is fast improving, raising the stature of space situational awareness as an indispensable component of space security. I think that there is generally a feeling that the sophistication and proliferation of threats have outstripped advances in satellite resiliency, deterrence strategies, and response option in case of an attack or an incident. What is different is that it is not only military assets, but also civilian and commercial ones that are now at greater risk of being disrupted, and the attacks are becoming more sophisticated. Cyber-related vulnerabilities of space assets are at the forefront of political and operational deliberations, and the establishment of an effective defense posture to secure confidentiality, integrity, and availability of space data has been a major concern. A less understood policy area is the proliferation of two different models of economic and financial development and outreach in the space sector. One is a state-led model, non-market model, aimed at creating sole source contractual agreements, dependencies, indebtedness, and even loss of sovereignty of the recipient countries. It is mainly visible in the partnering arrangements of Chinese and Russian state-owned or controlled enterprises and their subsidiaries. The other is a free market-based model that is based on internationally accepted rules that underpin the modern global financial and trading systems. The turnkey anti-competitive model of the state-controlled enterprises, reference above, entails the provision of on-orbit systems and their launch, the construction of ground stations, the provision of operating personnel and space-related equipment, products and services, and importantly, oftentimes 100% subsidized financing to uncredit-worthy state actors. These SOEs serve as a strategic tool of their governments and help increase their foreign footprints, build market share for their technology, equipment, and services, and gain political standing and influence in the recipient countries. This, in turn, has implications for diplomatic efforts to advance space governance in various multilateral institutions, such as the United Nations and its specialized bodies. What is especially troubling is that a number of these companies have already been sanctioned by the United States and or allied governments, such as Japan, for enabling national security and human rights abuses. I think that this element of space security is one that will increasingly gain more and more prominence. So with this, I will conclude the introductory remarks and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jana. I think it is extremely important that you mention the civil and the commercial activities and also the state-owned enterprise-led projects, which are also in the scope of the space governance. So let me just turn into a question prepared for this session to deepen the discussion on the militarization and the counter-space capabilities. So I'll ask you, what types of counter-space technologies present the highest risk? Can all counter-space technology should be treated as the same threats, or is there any differences? I'll ask all of you to answer this in 2 minutes. So let's just start from Victoria.
Sure. Well, I think the concerns that I have, I mentioned in my opening remarks the destructive versus non-destructive. Basically, for counter space capabilities, looking for non-destructive, it can be anything from radio frequency interference to looking at lasers for dazzling, not blinding, to cyber attacks. And so the concern I have for that is that oftentimes, these non-destructive weapons, as Malcolm said, are perceived as being more usable because they're not quite as inflammatory, they're not quite as escalatory, and they say, well, these are not permanent sort of damages being done to counter space capabilities. The problem with that is if it's your counter space capability being interfered with, you don't know what the enemy has planned. You don't know if they plan on doing it just for a short period, if it's going to go for a long period. Probably you don't know the extent of the destruction. You probably have to assume, worst case scenario, it's permanent and your asset is lost. And then you respond accordingly. So I think you can inadvertently escalate way beyond what you intended. And right now, the laws of armed conflict are really unclear in terms of how to handle these sort of counter space capabilities. There are a couple of different manuals that are being worked on, but they're years in the making. They may be done next year, 2022. But even in that case, it still takes time to proliferate. So we're in a very amorphous time where these capabilities are being used. We don't know how the laws of armed conflict or international humanitarian law apply to them, and it could be done at a time where it could inadvertently escalate. So that's kind of what I look at in terms of the worst case scenario. Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo what Victoria is saying. I think it's the soft kill, non-destructive weapons. I think, as I said in my opening statement, everyone understands the dangers posed by creating huge clouds of space debris. So that's going to be self-deterring to a degree. You could always sort of, conjure up the scenario of a North Korea that doesn't care and basically launches a gravel warhead into geo and shreds everything. But I think for most states, they will avoid using destructive means. I would also point out the grey zone in orbit, the potential for phase 0 pre-war operations of counter space capabilities that could be done either on the part of the state or on the part of a third party actor acting on behalf of the state. That to me seems quite dangerous because it's far more difficult for us to respond to those sorts of challenges in the grey zone in orbit than it would be in actual wartime. The CSIS released a fantastic report called Defense Against the Dark Arts in Space, which looked at this extensively. So I think that, the grey zone in orbit, the potential for non-destructive soft kill weapons, I think worries me more than hit to kill, kinetic kill ASATs that are being tested by the likes of China and Russia and others.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is an extremely concerning because of the attribution. I mean, it's also difficult to identify who is actually behind the attack, and you never know what the reason why the satellites are not functioning. When it's attacked, it was under the cyber attack. Ajay, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I will agree with Victoria and Malcolm. Slightly to widen the debate, normally there is a debate which happens that you compare nuclear domain or a cyber domain with a space domain. But unfortunately, everybody understands that nuclear weapons are not usable weapons. But that's not happening in the domain of a space. And people are now differentiating between hard kill options and soft kill options. And I think soft kill options only are going to come into a headway where electronic warfare threats could be there, cyber threats could be there. Like as you already said, that accountability will be a basic issue and you just don't know who has done this sort of an act. So I think the future right now appears to be only going into the direction of states or even a non-state actor developing certain amount of jamming technologies. Again, there are differences as far as electronic warfare means are concerned into a low Earth orbit. Basically, communication satellites are into a geostationary orbit. So people are making investments towards developing these technologies. And I think one has to be pretty sure that how to actually handle these types of threats. Because to handle a hard kill threat could be slightly an easier option because you just ban ASAT weapons, the kinetic weapons. But how about the soft weapons? And I think that is what is going to be the challenge for us. Thank you.
Oops. Yes, can you hear me? All right, sorry. Yes, okay. Thanks. So I will step back again a little bit and just note that I believe it's important to note that the global counterspace dynamic is primarily driven by the terrestrial geopolitical developments, including China's assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific, the US-China decoupling, or continuing downturn in relations between Europe and Russia. I think also there is an increased appetite for the development of counterspace capabilities by more nations as they explore using space to support their conventional military operations. Obviously, the destructive anti-satellite weapons such as the ground-based or orbital kinetic ASAT capabilities, electromagnetic pulse, or high-power lasers feature prominently as a concern during the due to their offensive nature. But as Malcolm pointed out, there is this worrying gray zone spectrum of threats that are associated with deliberate actions that are basically aimed at probing gaps in preparedness to protect space infrastructure. It is also, I think, important to know that this is not a new phenomenon, but what is important here that beyond the military assets, also civilian and commercial one are now at greater risk of being disruptive. So we're talking about jamming or spoofing, cyber attacks, proximity operations, directed energy operations, or economic and financial operations that I mentioned earlier. From my perspective, cyber-related vulnerabilities together with the economic and financial space operation are my top two concerns. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, all. So let's turn to the next question. What are the strategic options and responses that the nations are developing in order to secure their interest in and assets in space? In other words, is there any deterrence strategy or any other strategic options that they may have to protect their interest and assets? What are the possible scenario and what are the possible possible choices that the state may have? So again, let's just go through from Victoria.
I love going first. This is great. Sorry, guys. So yeah, I think it's interesting when people talk about strategic options. I mean, obviously, you think strategy, people go for the military and defensive, response and developing weapons. And I think probably the rest of the panel will talk about that. So what I'd like to talk about is something that's gaining more traction. The idea of getting a common understanding in terms of what responsible behavior is. Because right now, there is not a common understanding of this. There are times where countries feel others are acting irresponsibly, but they can't really point to a common definition and say, look, the international community has agreed that this is a bad thing, you need to stop it, which makes it difficult to have these conversations internationally. In multilateral fora, space security discussions have been essentially stopped for decades now. There's not been any real progress. They're the same circular arguments for decades now. Treaty, no treaty, treaty, no treaty. And the treaty in discussion talks about actually placing weapons in space, namely missile defense space-based interceptors, and banning those, which no one's really looking at. It's just more of a boogeyman sort of approach. So, I mean, it's been frustrating for me as an observer to watch this, but I've been very encouraged. And Malcolm brought up the UK resolution that came out last year. I talked about norms of behavior and talked about ask for countries to submit the UN Secretary General. What do they determine? A, the biggest threat to space security, because there's not even agreement about that. B, what do they see as responsible or alternatively irresponsible behavior? And C, what do they recommend for ways forward? Civil society was allowed to submit, and so full disclosure, Secure World submitted something as well. But I mean, looking at the UN Secretary General report, it was fascinating because I mean, there's a couple dozen countries that submitted things. And not everyone said the same thing, but a couple commonalities emerged. One, everyone pretty much agrees it's a bad idea to deliberately create long-lived debris on orbit. So whether you interpret that as supporting a kinetic energy sat test ban or some sort of modification thereof, it seems like everyone more or less thinks that's not good. Another one is, as Jana brought up the idea of proximity operations. There's a common understanding it's bad form to deliberately do non-consensual approaches to other countries' satellites, and so where you go with that, it's hard to say. And then they picked up a couple ideas in the Outer Space Treaty, the idea of operating with due regard, and non-interference. And what those means, I think we can have a discussion. But those came up, and what I found very encouraging as well, and I'll stop after I bring this up, is that the U.S. Secretary of Defense Austin released a memo in July of this year, where he named 5 norms of behavior he wants DoD to look at. And you know what? Deliberate creation of debris was one of them. Non-consensual approach is one of them, talking about acting with due regard, talking about acting with non-interference. And so I think we actually are at a point where we might be able to make some forward movement. The Brits have talked this fall about starting some sort of open-ended working group to pick up on some of these ideas of responsible behavior and hopefully make progress. We'll see what ends up happening with that, but I am color me cautiously optimistic. I think we might be able to make some movement on this. Thanks.
Right. I'll come back to this issue later, but yeah, it's an interesting movement that Brits are taking, and I think this open-ended consultation process may create some sort of a common ground for the further further discussion. Malcolm, what do you think about the strategic options that state may take?
Yeah, I think it goes back to my earlier point that space forces are very new. in the same way that air forces were very new in the early 20th century. And so in the same way that we developed our understanding and thoughts and principles of air power throughout both operational experience in the First and Second World Wars and beyond, and also through technological innovation over that period, going into the 60s and the 70s to where we are now with air power. I think you'll see in the 21st century the growth of thinking on space power and the operational use of space power, and with that strategic thought about the use of space as an operational domain. So I think this is a process that's just getting started, and there's this very interesting debate, between various different schools of belief in the US about space power, between the brown water, should we focus very much on the LEO to GEO environment, versus the blue water, which is focusing very much on the cislunar and beyond, and how do we project power in space and so forth. I think these are really healthy debates to have, because we do need to actually develop a concept and a theory of space power. It's very amorphous at the moment, because we really haven't had to think much about it, because up until very recently, space hasn't been that much contested. Certainly the Soviets had anti-satellite weapons in the Cold War, but both sides, I think, understood the dangers of using them in a nuclear context, so they kind of refrained from doing so. Now we're in a very different environment where our adversaries are developing a range of usable counter-space capabilities. We're responding in our own way in terms of building resilient space capabilities and space deterrence and space forces. And so I think we are getting started on a process of intellectual debate and discussion that will really shape how we think about strategy and theory going forward in the decades ahead. And that's going to take us in some pretty amazing directions. And it will bring in the sort of things that Victoria is talking about in terms of the arms control, the legal, the regulatory, the diplomatic aspects that will all shape that. And that aspect of that legal and regulatory and diplomatic side of things wasn't really there when air power was being developed. So that's a new factor going in with the development of space power thought. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, how it all develops in the coming years. And certainly countries like Australia are going to have an important role to play in that sense. Thank you.
Right. That's an interesting development in terms of the strategic thinking of the of power, and I think the comparison with the air power strategy seems to be relevant in a way, but I think it's a different thought, because space is already very commercialized and used with civilian actors as well, and it's also very difficult to define what space power is. So anyway, Ajay, what do you think?
I think I will go or expand what Malcolm has said. Actually, nowadays what is happening is that you are trying to look at a space from the dimensions either of an air power or from a maritime power. There has been, on a lighter note, an argument which has been made that there is no Mahan in the arena of a space. So there is no theory of a space power which has been actually properly developed, and it has not even evolved till date. So under these circumstances, the countries are looking at strategic options slightly in a very haphazard fashion. So based on their regional requirements, based on their security perceptions, based on how the entire domain of a space is expanding. Because I know when I was a school-going kid, there always used to be stories which I have read about colonization of outer planets. But today, at least, we are reaching to a reality. I never thought that this will become a reality in my lifetime, but now it is also going to become a reality. So when you are looking at a strategic options, I think the options are at two levels. One is that at a normal your military level, that is still say geostationary orbit, and then at a deep space level also. Because now commercialization of a space has added a very different and a new dynamics into it. One is not very sure how the entire zone of a commercialization of a space will go. More importantly, the technology used to be in the hands of a state power. That means NASA is developing a technology or other state-controlled agencies are developing technologies. But now technologies are getting developed into a private domain too. So there are going to be major issues which are going to come up in near future. I think one issue which I would like to make a mention over here, it is not an issue of a great importance at this point in time, but it may emerge. That is basically about management of the resources out into the space. Because today people are talking of going to the moon and Mars and doing some sort of excavation and getting the things back. So we don't have a legal justification of whether we are calling the other planets as a common heritage to mankind, or we are leaving it to the people who go there, do some sort of activity over there, have robotic equipment and get back the minerals or materials out from there. I think that is going to be an issue maybe in forthcoming 1 or 2 decades that may dominate. But at this point in time, I think states are putting very cautious steps, one can say, and developing their own agencies, looking at their own security perceptions. I think I'll stop here.
Having the ungrateful role of being the last speaker, I will seek to keep my remarks very brief and just complement what my other fellow speakers have already said. You all mentioned that countries are reviewing their space strategies and policies, and there is also a strengthened focus on complementing operations and mission assurance with doctrine, policy, organization, training, the leadership of space personnel, and also a collaboration with allies and partners. Which I would like to mention one more time, because I think that that is an increasing emphasis on finding ways how to better collaborate with existing allies, and but also how to forge what is called non-traditional partnerships, which I think is really important, as well as how to remain competitive in the emerging space markets in the areas such as positioning, navigation, timing, Earth observation, or communications. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, all. It's been a fascinating discussion. I think it was interesting that no one mentions about the multi-domain deterrence, or how to respond strategically when the space assets were attacked. But I think this is a kind of an issue in the future that, as Malcolm said, to be developed when we talk about the space power. How states can reply to the some counter space capabilities or counter space attack, and see how states are allowed to to set up this some sort of a norm that understand each other, that okay, if someone attack one satellite, then what's the proportionate response to other? And these kind of things will be needs to be discussed and needs to be shared. Otherwise, there'll be no, there'll be no escalation control. So I think this will be the some sort of course, this is not something written on the paper or discussed in the UN forum, but I think this is a kind of the strategic approaches that may have the implication for the future balance of power in space. So I think the time has come, and I again thank you for fascinating discussion and lots of inputs and lots of descriptions and the analysis of current capabilities and the future directions. And I also thank the Observer Research Foundation for organizing this session. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.